Hey, Kayla.
What's up, Nylah? Welcome all to Preservation for the People,
a new podcast where we talk about cultural heritage preservation and conservation as Black people, a platform where we can discuss preservation topics pertinent to us.
We are your hosts. I'm Kayla.
And I'm Nylah.
Let's get into it.
Welcome to the second episode of Preservation for the People, brought to you by the Black Art Conservators in collaboration with Urbanist Media and supported by a racial and social justice grant from the University of California, Los Angeles.
The Black Art Conservators, which you'll hear us call BAC, is a collective of Black preservation professionals supporting each other, building community, and seeking change in the predominantly white field of cultural heritage preservation.
We are not only your hosts, but two founding members of the Black Art Conservators.
My name is Kayla Henry-Griffin. I use they, them pronouns. I consider myself a time-based media conservator and a moving image archivist. I have an MA in moving image archiving and preservation from New York University. Currently, I'm taking an experimental photography class where we generate, quote, imperfect pictures, which includes archival images, surveillance images, and even memes.
That sounds really fun.
Thanks.
My name is Nylah Byrd. I use she, her pronouns, and my current position is as the Assistant Conservator of Objects and Programs Assistant at the Balboa Art Conservation Center in San Diego. I have a BA in Archaeology from Stanford University and an MS in Art Conservation from the Winchester University of Delaware Program in Art Conservation. And I'm currently working on a paper in collaboration with another art conservator about nails, nail extensions, fingernails, not tool nails in conservation. For a long time, the general rule was kind of like no nails, no nail polish, but that doesn't have to be the case.
With that in mind, today's topic for the podcast is the extraordinary of the ordinary.
I will say that the inspiration for this theme is basically, we all love to celebrate Black excellence, right? But what about Black mediocrity? Like, we know in this world that white mediocrity is rewarded all the time. And we want to shine a light on Black mediocrity and Black people just existing in their averageness and not necessarily being the first or the best or the top person to do anything. And I want to be very clear, my use of mediocrity in this sense is not meant to be negative or pejorative. It's meant to represent averageness and people just existing and not having to be the first, the best, the most, receive this necessarily like title or accolade for something that they're doing to be valid. I want to see a Black person being the 1010th person to do something and that being just as exciting and just as notable and just as rewarded because they're doing a good job. So my use of mediocrity isn't like saying that we're doing anything wrong. It's not meant to be negative. I feel like I don't have the like mediocrity comparison.
Right.
I can talk about, how we know who like, first like poets and lawyers and all of these people to do stuff. But it's like, I will say it is not funny. It's kind of like, it's unfortunate that today I think there are still a lot of Black firsts that occur.
Mm-hmm.
And, it just blows my mind every time. Like, it doesn't, but it does. I feel like I'll see announcements of like, usually Black women, especially in the cultural heritage sector, and it'll be like, oh, the first Black person to hold this like head curator position or something like that. And it's like, wow, really?
Right. At like a major institution.
Uh-huh.
Right. We tend to forget and erase this Black mediocrity or forget that, there are people doing the work, but they're not the top or the first at like a certain institution or what have you.
Like, we know that if you want to be recorded in white-centered historical and cultural institutions, you basically have to be the best or first Black person to do something. And not discrediting at all that there's definitely power and agency in being the first or the best, but there's an equally powerful way of not being the first or the best and just allowing yourself to be authentic without being pressured by these societal Western ideologies.
Yeah, exactly. And what I want to add to that is that we want to record, conserve, and remember Black culture, not only being the first in something, or just even during Black History Month. Black excellence is great, but so is Black mediocrity.
So, with that kind of being said, we're going to talk about something special that we hold dearly, but might just be an ordinary thing. And I think that's something that a lot of people don't think about. It's kind of like ordinary things that we think are special. And of course, we think they're special, but like these are the kind of things that I feel like should end up in well, maybe not should end up in museums, because we could talk about how a lot of people feel like museums are where cultural heritage goes to die and whatnot. So when I say end up in a museum, I don't necessarily mean that, but I mean like preserved and shared and spread and like these stories collected and whatnot. So yeah, so Kayla, what's one thing that's special to you that might just be an ordinary thing to somebody else?
I would say it's the television. And there's like a huge story behind that for me personally. Like, of course, one can argue the TV is like a luxury item, which I definitely agree with that. But the TV was such an ordinary thing in my household growing up. And it was basically where I like had quality time with my family. I would learn about communities other than mine from the news or television shows that I saw growing up. I just truly appreciate the transition and evolution of the physicality of the TVs as well. It's just such a great reminder of how technology pivots to people's needs and wants. It's extraordinary to me knowing that it's such an ordinary thing and people don't think
Yeah.
twice
Yeah.
about it.
My example is like a stuffed animal that I've had ever since I was practically a baby. And I feel like a lot of people, carry things with them from childhood throughout adulthood. But I picked this particular stuffed animal because I've like tried to care for it. I remember when my mom was like doing some cleaning and whatever and was kind of like, "Do you want to get rid of this?" And I was like, "No, what are you talking about?" She was kind of like, "But it's dirty." And I was like, "Okay, can we put it in the washing machine?" Like, what? And we did that. Stuffed animal survived and came out of the washing machine and I believe the dryer just fine. I can't remember if we put it in both or if I just like tried to let it air dry or whatever. But it was fine. And I took a razor to it to get off the little like, you know how fabric pills after a while, depending on what it is, and it forms little balls. If you take a razor, you
Yeah.
can kind of scrape all of those off. So I've like done that. And I made in grad school during when we were learning about preventive conservation, we were doing an exercise just experimenting with like different mount making materials and stuff. And so I made him a little couch out of this like fall shaped material that he sits on. So it's like part preservation and just part cute. But I brought up the stuffed animal because I was like, I kind of incorporated it into conservation that way. I was like, well, he's been with me this long, so might as well try and keep him.
Oh my goodness, that's so cute. I had something similar to that as well. And it was a blanket my mom's friend made for me when she was pregnant with me. And I still have it to this day. And I remember being swaddled with it and being covered with it and like for some reason keeping me warm, even though it's like the thinnest fabric I've ever seen. And it's like it has like a lot of stories to it just because like content warning, I'm going to talk about blood a little bit, but like my first nosebleed, I remember it having like spots of blood on it. And it's just like, it's a security thing now. It's a security blanket. So like I took that everywhere I went because it brought me comfort and it held that story of me freaking out over my nose bleeding. But yeah, I treasure that always. And it's in not the best shape whatsoever.
Right,
like
right.
at all. There's like rips and tears, like it's been used lovingly.
Yeah,
So,
well loved.
yeah.
I love that phrase. I've used that in like my report writing and stuff like that. This book was well loved. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like this whole all of these examples really get at the crux of why we wanted this to be the topic of conversation. Because I think sometimes it's something that not a lot of people think about in terms of the things that they interact with. So it's not just, the old photographs that like of people that you want to preserve. Those are definitely important, don't get me wrong, but like something that I associate a lot of meaning to is like my grandma's knife set. My grandma is no longer with us, but like her house was the house that we would gather at for, Thanksgiving dinner and Christmas dinner and everything. So I just associate her with cooking. And I remember just being young and like looking at the knife set in the kitchen, just being like, wow, there's so many knives. Like, there's a plethora of things I could have picked, right? But like it really was something that I think I just hyper focused on for some reason, because like she's got these decorative plates and stuff like that she would use that I think one of my aunts or one of my cousins has or something like that. Like there's a lot of stuff that's been passed down to like other family members that's just like little tchotchkes and things like that, but it's like from my grandma's house. And so it's been really cool actually to go like visit my family that are like in other parts of the country and see like my grandma's stuff. And I'm like, oh, so it's like, it's kind of like a little piece of home is like everywhere now. And I think that's really special. But I'm sort of getting sidetracked into just like family heirlooms and why they're important, which is related to the theme. But it does go back to the intangible aspects of cultural heritage. And I think that's kind of what we're getting at here is, the stories that make something special. Because if you just saw a random knife set, especially in like a thrift store or something, like you're not going to think twice about it necessarily in terms of what it meant to whoever had it before,
Right, exactly. And speaking about ordinary things that you can find at a Goodwill or like any vintage shop, the guest we're interviewing today studies Black sartorial practices, which is a fancy term for basically how you dress your body with clothes, jewelry, piercings, shoes, all of that. Our guest for today is Dr. Ayana Flewellen, who is a Black feminist, an archaeologist, a storyteller, and an artist. They are the co-founder and current president of the Society of Black Archaeologists and an assistant professor at Stanford University in the Department of Archaeology. But before we start with the questions, I want to give Dr. Flewellen a chance to tell us a bit more about themselves.
Yeah, I'm Dr. Ayana Omilade Flewellen. I am an assistant professor at Stanford University, co-founder of the SBA. I sit on the board of Diving with a Purpose, and I've been practicing archaeology since my introduction to it. The first site that I worked on was a National Park Service site called Kingsley Plantation off the coast of Jacksonville, Florida, on Fort George Island. That site became the foundation for my master's research that I did at the University of Texas at Austin, really thinking about the representation of Black women and our histories and stories at National Park Service sites, particularly the stories that were and were not being told at Kingsley Plantation. And my dissertation really bloomed and blossomed from my love of Black women and my love of adornment and jewelry practices. And I've been focusing on sartorial practices of self-making that Black women engaged post-emancipation. And that was the dissertation work that's the foundation for my book project, which is totally about sartorial choice post-slavery in Texas and in Tennessee, and kind of structures the work that I do on land, which is totally different than the work that I do underwater, which has mainly been with a different organization called Diving with a Purpose. And that's a nonprofit organization dedicated to oceanic conservation and preservation of submerged heritage resources, with a particular emphasis on submerged heritage pertaining to the African diaspora. And it's through my work with Diving with a Purpose that I've been introduced to maritime heritage and thinking about how the waterways around the world in this country hold so much of our histories that we oftentimes are unaware of, And when we are aware of them, oftentimes don't have access to. So a lot of my newer work is centering on how we can counter these histories and thinking about not only the preservation of submerged heritage resources pertaining to the African diaspora, but how we can get more African Americans in the water to participate in the unearthing recovery of these histories, the stewardship of these heritage sites.
You already answered my first question, which was going to be like, how did you get into archaeology and the work you're doing? So you're ahead of the game. But we like to talk about get a little into semantics here and talk about some terminology for a second, just in terms of what defines care and preservation for dress, accessories, attire, and does it differ from the preservation of other materials? Should it? How does that kind of category come into itself and differentiate itself?
Yeah, so I definitely would say within the realm of preservation and thinking about material culture more broadly, the materials that I'm looking at are oftentimes small finds that are recovered at plantation and post-plantation context. So within the book itself, I'm looking at 3 different sites. I'm looking at the Hermitage Plantation in Nashville, Tennessee, and then we're looking at the Sarah and Ransom Williams site in Central Texas, and then we're moving to Dallas and looking at materials that were recovered from the Dallas Freedman Cemetery. And these materials, some of which are still being held in collection facilities like the Hermitage Plantation materials that are being held in the Texas archaeological collections and stewarded by the Texas Historical Commission. And then materials like those recovered from the Dallas Freedman site have actually been reinterred. So there are different ways in which people are interacting with these materials. But because they all came from an archaeological context, I'm mainly looking at small finds that would have held textiles together. So I'm thinking about the kind of beads, buckles, buttons, corset fasteners, hoops that would have been within like caged skirts and hoop skirts. So those kinds of materials are in archaeology are considered small finds. And it's those small finds that make up the kind of data sets that I'm looking at, where at least within the context of the Hermitage and within the context of the Sarah and Ransom Williams site, you don't actually have textiles to look at. So I can look at the kind of small finds that are available to me to then think about, okay, well, where were these fasteners located in different kinds of ready-made clothing at the time? Thinking about like collar studs or the kind of components that would make up suspender fasteners or the kind of garments that typically were coming into fashion at like the late 19th, turn of the 20th century. And you can kind of think through, okay, well, what fasteners would have made up those garments? What fasteners are we seeing at a site? How can we make a connection between the two? But I haven't had to deal at all with the preservation of textiles, which I'm actually rather grateful for because that could be rather complex. But a lot of the materials that are being recovered for small finds are glass buttons, glass beads, glass and ceramic, beads, buttons, metal fasteners that have all gone through, at least in their initial recovery, a conservation effort to preserve them so that I can come back to these collections, because I wasn't the archaeologist who dug at the Ransom and Sarah Williams farmstead. I wasn't the archaeologist that dug at the Hermitage Plantation, but I could come back, 10 years after this work has been completed and ask new questions of this material precisely because of the kinds of work that conservation has put in on the front end to make that possible. I'm going to close my window because I feel like my neighbor is having too much fun with her dog outside. I don't know if y'all could hear that or not.
Thank you. But you were just talking about like preservation of textiles and also conservation being like allowing you to interact with some of these things now. So, and this is something we want to ask all of our guests, but like from your perspective, what's the difference between conservation and preservation?
Yeah, wow. Tough questions. When I think about conservation, I think about the kind of necessity of conserving what is already present. So I felt preservation more specifically, I think about the kind of long-term sustainability, not only the object itself, but the kind of data and metadata that has been extracted and connected to that object. And when I think about conservation, I think I actually think of like the maintenance of the object and not necessarily the kind of data retrieval and duplication that might occur with like the creation of like digital means or digital replicas of things afterwards. But I'm almost certain that that's not a real kind of difference between the two. I will say that within archaeology, so much of this discipline is centered on fieldwork and the extraction of materials. And quite a bit is centered on lab work and the kind of analysis of those materials, the cleaning of those materials, creating data sets based off of those materials. But even within our kind of academic training, there's no real turn towards conservation, preservation of the materials themselves. Like that's not part of our graduate training. At least it wasn't in my program. So I think it's interesting in the kind of like interplay of those two words where I think about it as like, yeah, these are practices of care and how we care for the materials and then how we think about the kind of long-term impact and care, not only of the object itself, but like of the data and the sharing of that data afterwards. But I don't believe that it was like something in like a structured conversation and like a intro to archaeology and archaeology theory class and my intellectual sort of foundation.
So we both read the article about the Danish plantation excavation, the estate Little Princess. It's really fascinating. What we wanted to ask you was what inspired the training program for at Estate Little Princess?
Yeah, the Estate Little Princess archaeology project has been ongoing since 2017. And it takes place at an 18th century Danish sugar plantation that was known as the Estate Little Princess and is now being stewarded by the Nature Conservancy, whose primary goal and at that site and throughout the region as well is conservation efforts towards and for both landscapes and seascape. Our work at that site has primarily looked at the enslaved village area there. And the youth component that you're referring to is the youth archaeology field school that we've had since 2017 at the estate, where we've invited students from the Caribbean Center for Boys and Girls to come excavate alongside us in collaboration with archaeology in the community, which is led by one of our co-directors, Dr. Alexandra Jones. The project was really born out of initial meetings that we had with community members in 2016, prior to any work actually being done at the estate, where community members who had already been doing heritage preservation work on St. Croix really wanted their youth on island to be a part of this work. They felt like their youth were being left out of initiatives for heritage preservation, archaeology, and the like. So Justin and I, who were the two founders for that project, sat with each other as we were thinking about how to build out work on St. Croix. And we were like, we need to have a youth component to be a part of this. The person that does youth work the best in this field is Alexandra Jones with archaeology in the community. And she came in with a team and was really dedicated to not only developing a program that was catered towards youth, but actually turning towards the curriculum that's being taught in K through 12 classrooms on St. Croix to look at how archaeology can feed into their social studies and earth-based science curriculum that they're already learning in their classrooms. So yeah, it was a huge component that was born from the desires and needs of community members on St. Croix.
That's really amazing. I think I'm part of a similar project. Well, it's not archaeologically based, but it's called Train the Trainer. And we essentially host a boot camp for like elementary and high school teachers to learn a lot about conservation. And then they go back to their schools and incorporate everything like we taught them into their own curriculum and like lessons and everything for the students.
I feel like I need a transition for this next question. How do your own sartorial practices mold your identity?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think I love this. I love this question. I am teaching a class right now called The Will to Adorn. And mind you, the will to adorn itself, it's a term and phrase that I have borrowed. The will to adorn is a phrase that I have borrowed from Zora Neale Hurston. She talks about how African-American expressions of dress and sartorial practice are the will to adorn and really speak to the soul of the creator. So I think about these practices that seemingly feel rather innocuous and everyday and quotidian to us, dressing our bodies and what we do to maintain our bodies and our kind of understanding of what hygiene and maintenance looks like are rather culturally informed. And the cultural formations of them are historically rooted and oftentimes are historically rooted in understandings of anti-Blackness that aren't always clearly articulated. So am I thinking about all these things as I get dressed every day? No, but I do think as I shape my own everyday sort of dress practice, how I want to not only show up in this world, but how I also want to be read. And I think so much of my own engagement with adornment has so much to do with how I've discovered that for myself over the years, especially as someone who was assigned female at birth, who identifies as gender nonconforming, who's rather expressive, and a myriad of gender identity expressions in my own dress and adornment. And while I was growing up, I loved to make jewelry. It was something that I did with my mother. And I remember when I was thinking about what to do for my dissertation research, I had a real conversation with my advisor where I was just like, Maria, I cannot do a dissertation that is looking at another assemblage and thinking about counts of ceramics. I don't want to do it. Like, I will lose my mind. And if I have to be here for 7 years, I want to feel something while I'm here. And I was like, if there's a topic that I feel and am connected to, it's adornment. And it's the practice of self-baking and how in those practices, a lot can be learned about how people come to understand themselves, how people come to understand themselves in relationship to groups that they find affiliation with, and relationships to groups outside of that. So that's really been my relationship to adornment more broadly, both personally and then within scholarship.
How does being an artist and a jewelry maker kind of inform your research into adornment? Like being on kind of both sides of the thing.
Yeah. Being an artist, and I don't engage with sewing, but being an artist that works quite a bit with metal work, bending, twisting metal, jewelry making allows me to think about the labor on the body to create, right? And I think oftentimes, because of our own relationship to fast fashion today, there's not a real understanding around the labor it takes to even produce the clothing that we have today, let alone the clothing that was worn in the past, jewelry that was worn in the past. So I think because artists are so engaged with the labor that they exert to create whatever it is within the medium that they create in, there's a way that it then shapes how I understand the past. And I'm able to think about the realities of the labor involved, the technology involved, the skill involved, the knowledge involved in craft production, right? To actually like sit with Nancy as a seamstress. And then one of the older women at the site, Betty, who was a cook at the Hermitage. And I remember speaking to one of the former curators at the site who said, Betty is wearing a damask caplet, which is the same fabric that is actually still hanging in the Andrew Jackson mansion today. And when you think about that, you also think, that fabric is used for curtains and oftentimes used for furniture. It's very thick, heavy. You think about the power and nature of being able to transform that into a garment that's being worn, and the skill set that was needed and necessary to do that work and labor. There were 2 seamstresses at that site who could have done this work, who could have had this knowledge, and they were related to one another. It was Nancy, and then it was her aunt, Gracie. So I think being an artist and being in the mindset of an artist allows you to think expansively about labor, about creation, about knowledge and skill sets needed. And thinking like very specifically about clothing itself, I oftentimes think that there's a kind of frivolity that's thought of around it within the field and discipline, which typically comes when people think about labor connected to women specifically. But really being able to peel that open feels important for me.
I just agree and resonate with what you said. I feel like people forget or people just don't acknowledge.
Yeah.
Like adornment, dressing for yourself, it holds a lot of power and holds a lot of labor on it as well. So yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah. A question I return to in my mind, and I don't have an answer for it, but and specifically on the topic of fast fashion, when I first really got into conservation and started pursuing it as a career and was learning about preservation of textiles and all of these things. And I was just because usually you see fancy, extraordinary garments, and that tends to be what is kept as exemplary. And you see all of these high class things, which are fantastic and wonderful and beautiful. And it just got me thinking, is my Forever 21 dress going to show up in a museum one day? What if all the clothes that we wear every day that, like you said, are quotidian to us that we don't really think about. You mentioned that your work isn't, quote, archaeological enough. And I wonder, has this concern changed as you've continued to do your research? Does it still show up? How have you navigated that kind of thought?
Oh my goodness. I know that I've said that before. When I started working with a developmental editor, Jane Jones, it would come up often in our discussions together, how I would really defend, this is archaeological. The questions that I ask are archaeological. The methods that I use are archaeological. Black feminist work within archaeology is archaeological. And I have shifted. I have shifted. I am no longer here to prove the work that I do is archaeology or not.
Mm-hmm.
The people that I'm speaking to, the audience that's for this book, that question is actually not up for debate. It's not a question. It's not a question for me either anymore, which I'm really grateful
Fantastic.
For.
Yeah.
And I will say that probably comes with actually getting your degree, getting a job, being able to say, yeah, I do archaeology and this is archaeological. So I know that all of that also shapes the kind of more solid foundation in which I stand to say this today with greater confidence. But even prior to my tenure at Stanford, and even when I was doing my tenure at the University of California, Riverside, these questions around, is this archaeological enough? I think for so many scholars of color, and I see this for myself at being of African descent, and I see this so often with Indigenous scholars as well, this question of enough is so detrimental to our mental health. And when we sit and think about and circle and spiral around the enough part, it takes up so much time that we could have spent doing the work we were here to do. That's what I've decided to do. I was I'm just going to do the work that I'm here to do.
Yeah.
And whether or not people want to say that it's archaeology is for them. That's a conversation that you get to have. And it's not a conversation that I'm willing to engage. And
yeah.
So yeah.
That feels so freeing.
It is. It really is.
These interviews have just been so rejuvenating for me, which is fantastic.
Yeah.
Like I just feel I'm always so excited after we're done. I'm like, I gotta go out and do stuff. It doesn't necessarily always translate directly to productivity, but definitely always leave feeling inspired. And one of the things that, like, you know, speaking of kind of releasing ourselves from these like white supremacist standards, you know, and how Ayana was talking about how she doesn't really ask herself if her work is archaeological enough or not anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Who are we asking this to? And even if it's not, quote, archaeology enough or whatever, it doesn't mean it's not important.
Exactly.
You know? Why do we need the white man's paperwork? You know what I mean?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yeah. I definitely agree with you, Nylah. Like, I felt that personally just because, like, I consider myself a time-based media conservator and a moving image archivist. I feel like I'm always in between, and I always feel as if I'm not doing enough to be either one of those things. But like after talking to Ayana, it was like, oh, I am those things, and I don't need to question myself.
Yay. But I feel you on the like being stuck in between something, since I specialized in like objects and library and archives conservation. And like, you know, the way my graduate program was set up, I was able to major in one and minor in the other. I wanted to keep doing both, like postgraduate. I wasn't just like trying to pick one, because my main motivation for doing that in the first place was I was thinking about what I would encounter in like somebody's house. This was like my like vague vision of like how I was going to be a conservator in the future. And so I'm like, what am I experiencing that people are like using like in their day-to-day lives? And of course, objects is the broadest one. And so you'd find anything and everything under the sun in somebody's like attic or basement or whatever, especially because that's where people tend to store these things. But also, you know, books, photo albums, like documents, like birth certificates and stuff like that. There's a lot of like common bound and paper-based material that I also think is common in like a household in terms of like family history. But it's been interesting like navigating that, and I'm really thankful that I'm in a position now where I can still use both, even though like I'm literally on paper an objects conservator. But one of the first things I did at my job was create a reference sheet for people to take home. There was this exhibit. It was a lot of people who had given stuff from their kind of like family archive kind of thing. And so after the exhibit, we wanted to give people like some care tips. So when they take the materials back home and stuff like that, they can, you know, maybe potentially put it back in a maybe better state. Of course, there's a sort of hierarchy and established process in museums, large cultural heritage institutions about kind of like what gets preserved and what doesn't. And, you know, in like a library setting, for example, there's like the special collections, and it's because, you know, they're usually rare books and stuff like that. Democratizing that decision making so that people are like making those decisions for themselves in their personal collections, and we don't have to wait until something gets to a fancy library or something like that for people to say like, oh, okay, I can like put this in a box in a folder now and it's fine, you know?
Yeah. It reminds me of classmates that I had in my graduate program who created this, I'll call it a brochure, for people trying to preserve their family films, like home movies. And I thought that was like one of the best ideas in that class. And I was like, what am I doing with my own project? But giving the agency to that person rather than you to make the decision.
Yeah. I feel like we're kind of trying to break out of what seems like a self-fulfilling prophecy of like, once upon a time, people with lots of like money and resources and time, because they probably had money to pay like staff to do other things in their life that like regular people who don't have a lot of money just have to do themselves, right? And so someone like that would have time to like think about preserving, you know, scrapbooks and the money to be able to like pay a conservator, or even just like even if we're talking about before the establishment of conservation, because it's still a relatively recent field. Like, you know, even before that, like people are like have big houses with storage space and stuff like that. If you live in a smaller house and don't have a lot of storage space, clearly you're prioritizing things that you're like practically using and not just like dedicating a space to whatever you're trying to save, right? And so because of all of these things, this is what we get that ends up in collections. And it's like the things that like fancy rich people have owned and stuff like that, which is not, you know, representative of everybody. And so just like democratizing the preservation knowledge, right? Therefore, hopefully people can like find some time to do it. Cause that's another thing, right? You can know all about what you're supposed to do, but it's like, well, you know, you still have to have the time to actually do it. So like that's another barrier that exists. And this is like no shade to anyone who's too busy to sit down and like put all of their archives in folders or anything. You're fine and you're valid.
I mean, I'm in that position right now.
Right. See, yeah. Like even preservation professionals don't always do it with all of their own stuff. Like, ugh. If I had my way with everything, I could like apply for a grant or something. Somebody would give me money so I could just like preserve my family's historical collections and stuff. Like when I was in grad school, my aunt had just posted on Facebook and she tagged me. She was like, you got to come fix these photos. Cause I think we had posted something about like finishing photo block or something like that. My aunt was like, you got to come fix these photos that I have. And I was like, oh my God, you're right. Like kind of, even though I'm not a photograph conservator, like that's not what I chose to specialize in. But given all of the time that I've spent into this, I want to be able to at least put it to use like for my own sake, as well as in my job and whatnot.
So Nylah and I are only 2 of the 20 members of BAC. We thought it would be helpful for the audience to hear from other BAC voices. So, to close out the show, we have created a segment we like to call Conservator Spotlight.
And each spotlight will highlight the work of one of BAC's members, so you can hear more from than just us, Kayla and I. This episode, our spotlight is on Ayana McCow, who's the president and founder of Zilani Glass Conservation.
I've been in the field of conservation for 30 years, and I've owned my company for 21. And I predominantly focus on stained glass conservation. Initially, I was working in museums, and since the company was established, we also work mainly out in the fields as well as in the studio, meaning that we do everything. We take windows out, we take them to the studio, we preserve and conserve them, and then we reinstall them back into their architectural setting. So that's my first job. The other thing I'm really passionate about doing is disseminating information about conservation and preservation work to a larger audience, especially people who aren't necessarily given the opportunity through various means to have access to conservation. And I'm really lucky because my studio's in West Oakland. And so a lot of people can come to the studio here with pretty easy access, can talk about our work and introduce them to a potential field that many people haven't thought about as a profession. So that's really exciting for me. For the longest time, I had my grandfather's crescent wrench that I used to hold my soldering iron on when I was soldering, because obviously you can't put your iron on your wooden bench because you start to burn the bench. And there are other holders that you can use that are officially for soldering irons, but this one was a tie back to my grandfather, who was a carpenter, who got me my first tool set when I was 7. So I thought that was really awesome. And one time I was flying actually from Northern California to Southern California to go work at the Getty, and it was a quick job. So I didn't check my baggage. I just had it in my bag. And as I went through the security, they said, oh, well, that's a weapon. And I'm like, no, that's a tool. That's my grandfather's tool. And they're like, well, you can't take it through with you. And I was like, well, what am I supposed to do with it? And they're like, well, throw it away. And I'm like, this is a tool from 1920. I'm not going to throw this away. They're like, well, you can send it back to you. And I'm like, I'm going to miss my plane. And so I very distinctly remembering saying a little bit louder so other people would hear me, saying like, this is a very precious tool. I can't hold on to it anymore. And like delicately placing it on top of the trash can with the hope that someone would pick it up and it would have its third life. So that's something that a lot of people wouldn't think was a really precious tool or it's something that was very important, but it was obviously very important to me. I have more tools from him, I should say. I think it would be a very different story if that was like the only tool he left me, but there are actually quite a few tools that we use in heavy rotation in the studio. So it was sad in the moment, but I have many other tools that are used a lot that have him involved. And to tie it to stained glass, we have a new hire, and she was asking about some pieces. Stained glass skeletons, I guess, is a good way to describe them. There is a way when you dismantle a window and to get the glass out, you can either destroy the lead came outline completely as you go, or you can sort of, the best way people can envision it is sort of sardine can one side of it. And so you can pop the glass out and the other side, you can still see the pattern of what the window was. And so this new employee was asking about one of these pieces. And I said, oh, well, it's from this church that we worked for over 10 years around the church. And the window started to tell us this story about the life of the studio, because the first ones we looked at were kind of odd in the way they were comprised together. And then you could sort of see that the studio grew and the windows were built a little bit better. And then there's this weird area where the lead is used. For example, it's supposed to be one long line that's a certain width, let's say half an inch. And instead of being one long 4-foot line of 1 inch, it goes from an inch to 3/16 to a quarter. Like all these little pieces are soldered together, and it doesn't make any sense within the context of the window. But then if you look at the year that the window was made, it was during a world war. And so they didn't have access to a whole bunch of lead. And so that tells the fact that they were using all these scraps that they had left over from other windows to comprise this window within time, because that's all they had. And then it kind of gets a little bit better. And then you can see the swan song of when the last few panels were made before the studio closed and the owner died. They weren't as great as the original ones, sort of thinking about maybe their eyes weren't as good, or they couldn't build as well, or something like that. So for me, that's really exciting, being able to see the history of a whole studio and having the privilege to work in one place for such a long time that we can see the overarching history of one studio as opposed to just working on one object. And that's something that people who work in building preservation, I think sometimes don't even think about that special access that they have. If you're working on a whole building where these windows have been commissioned over decades and sometimes even, hundreds of years. We, all the folks in BAC and Black conservators in general, we are the extraordinary and the ordinary, right? If you think about narrowing down definitions of who folks are, if you think about art conservators in general, I don't know how many times I've heard people saying, oh yeah, I share what I do as a profession. And everyone's like, wow, I've never heard of that job before. And then you narrow it down to working on a certain discipline. That becomes even more finite. And then you're a Black art conservator. You're dealing with whatever medium you choose to work with. You're also interacting with folks who very often don't have the similar history as you. And often you're also representing all of Black folks unintentionally, right? Because if people start to ask you, we all, like all human beings, are very individual. And I think it's very extraordinary that so many of us have chosen this profession and the art has resonated with us, and this path in relating to art has resonated with us enough that we've chosen this extraordinary field within ordinary objects. I would like to be less extraordinary. I want to be more ordinary. I want there to be tons of us. And so it is less of a novelty and more of a community.
Thanks for joining us on Preservation for the People. brought to you by Black art conservators and supported by a racial and social justice grant from the University of California, Los Angeles.
Many thanks to everyone who made this episode possible. The UCLA Codeson Institute of Archaeology and the UCLA Getty Interdepartmental Program in Conservation of Cultural Heritage. Andrew Calloway, Decca Hussein Wetzel, and Vanessa Quirk of Urbanist Media. If you or your organization are interested in making a podcast, then reach out to them at urbanistmedia.org.
Keep a lookout for the next episode, where we talk about the uniqueness of Black art conservation.
We're here.
Get used to it. And remember, preservation is for the people.